In this presentation, I will discuss some key points of the report which concern the case of Finland, situation in Finland, and I will also say a few words about the banning of the Nordic resistance movement in Finland, and also its consequences, what happened after the ban, because that's of course important for others also who perhaps are considering measures against extreme right movements. So it's a kind of important case to follow. But first of all, just a few words about how the extreme right movements or extreme right or violent extremism in general is tackled in Finland. What kind of measures have been taken in Finland regarding these issues. So preventing violent extremism in Finland is based on a Danish model, or so-called Aarhus model, which emphasizes the inter-administrative work with local authorities and communities. And a Finnish model, as well as in Denmark as well, cover all forms of extremism. And the preventive measures are coordinated by the Ministry of Interior. Alongside with these measures, we have had also a so-called exit program, which however was discontinued in 2018 and relaunched in 2020. These both programs have been realized by the NGOs and typically also had some certain kind of problems with continuity because of lack of funding and so on. These are, I guess, quite typical problems when working with the NGOs. And also, of course, it's not that easy always to find a suitable partner for example, exit programs. Regarding the legislation in Finland, well, there has been only one case where terrorism-related crimes have been actually a few cases which are prosecuted, but only one conviction so far. That is to Islamist terror attack in 2017. To some extent, perhaps this is the lack of prosecution is due to the relatively narrow legal definition of terrorism in Finland, which is based on the seriousness of the case. Some authorities have considered that the bar for prosecuting these cases, terrorism cases, are actually too high. Some new legislation also has been proposed, which would, for example, make it illegal to join a terrorist organization, but this is still, I suppose, under discussion. But there are, of course, other means available when trying to tackle extremism or right-wing extremism or any other form of extremism. For example, the Nordic resistance movement, when it was banned in 2020 by the Supreme Court, it was actually made on the basis of Associations Act. Also, racist motive may be considered as an aggravating circumstance when imposing a penalty, and this is also something that was used against one member of the Nordic resistance movement a few years ago. And also quite recent cases that the Nordic resistance movement was investigated for incitement when using swastika flags. So there are other ways than just terrorism provisions to tackle extremist movements. So which are the most important right-wing extremist organizations in Finland? Well, as mentioned, Nordic resistance movement in Finland, it was banned in 2020, and it has been maybe the most important neo-Nazi group in Finland. It was founded after a Swedish model in 2008 and grew to consist of around 100 activists, not including all the supporting members. There have been something like 200 or even more supporting members. We don't know exact figures for those. Many of these members had background in skinhead or other subcultures. Nordic resistance movement in Finland, as elsewhere, has been a hierarchical and very militant organization, and they do not shy away from using violence. However, when comparing the Nordic resistance movement in, for example, in Sweden, Finns have engaged relatively rarely in violent attacks. Most of the violence which has happened in the context of demonstrations or street activism of the Nordic resistance movement. They are, to some extent, one would call them defensive after some kind of a provocation, although the bar for starting violent activism actions seems to be quite low. Recurring violent attacks led to the landing of the Nordic resistance movement, a process which started in 2017 after one attack in Helsinki. Another important group, especially from the transnational perspective, is Solidus, which started in Finland in autumn 2015. It has been is still existing, and it's a vigilante street patrol organization. And at best, it had as many as chapters, international chapters, as many as in 30 countries or even more at some stages. They grew quite rapidly after the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. At best, they had more than 600 members, but this number has dwindled drastically since then. Interesting also in Solidus is that it was built around Facebook groups and based also on a franchise model. So it was very easy to start new chapter of Solidus wherever in the world you might be. So as we know that there used to be Solidus chapters as far as in Australia. And then of course there are several subcultural groups. Most important perhaps is the Blood and Honor, which is quite old in Finland. Also, first Blood and Honor movement in Finland started already in the 1990s, and after some discontinuation, it restarted in 2003. Regarding financing of the extreme right organizations in Finland, as far as it is known, the extreme right organizations in Finland have been mostly self-funded, and at least in most known cases, they also use only legal means to get funds for their operations. Key sources of revenue have been membership fees, sales of merchandise, record sales, and concerts. And lots of this also happens. For example, sales of merchandise or record sales happens online. And these days also some online concerts have been organized. They also accept donations which are made by using bitcoins. Try to maintain anonymity via that. To show the scale of the operation, some exact figures are actually known from the Nordic resistance movement annual revenues from their webshop and their membership fees, which were in total around 17,000 euros in 2015. So it's not very big, but big enough to operate also internationally, transnationally. Solidus had been in much better position because they gathered membership fees from these more than 30 foreign chapters, and in total it was the sums were in more than tens of thousands of euros. But also there's some problems with this kind of funding system because several international foreign chapters refused to pay and decided to leave the Solidus in 2016 and 17. Now Solidus has something like less than 5 countries represented in their network. So regarding transnational connections, already referred to, Nordic resistance movement in Finland has had several links with German organizations, and it appears that some of these links still exist even after the Nordic resistance movement was banned in Finland. Some former members have taken part, for example, in demonstrations in 2020 in Germany and in other countries, I suppose, as well. Also, one of the key links for the Nordic resistance movement has been national action in the UK, very close associate with the Finnish Nordic resistance movement. They supported each other ideologically and have had even some membership exchange. one member of the Nordic National Action who used to belong to Nordic Resistance Movement was convicted for his membership in National Action. During the Russo-Ukrainian War, Finnish Nordic Resistance Movement chapter has sided mostly with Ukraine, although a few members have pro-Putin attitudes as well. Finnish neo-Nazis have had contacts with Russian groups like Wotan Jugend, which however oppose Putin and are pro-Ukraine. Soldiers born in international network pretty much, as said, collapsed around 2016 or 2017, much due to the internal schism. Finns wanted membership fees, which foreign chapters refused to pay. There are also lots of contacts at the subcultural scene in Finland, transnational contacts. They visit each other's concerts, events, and also sometimes record together, and then also finance the transnational movement by recording albums and selling those online. Short diagram about the key events in Finland. Arguably, the 2015 refugee crisis was the key moment in mobilization of the far right in Finland, and after the wave of it was followed by certain kind of wave of violence, such as arson attacks against refugee reception centers in autumn 2015 and 2016 spring. After that, violence has not been so prominent part of the extremist scene in Finland. Even after 2017, Turku Islamist terrorist attack reaction to the far right were mostly verbal, no physical violence actually followed. 2015 attacks were also influenced by the similar attacks in Sweden and Germany. Violent riots, which I already mentioned, then caused the ban of the Nordic Resistance Movement in 2020. One notable event perhaps was also that Finns party turned to more radical direction in 2017, and to some extent this also affected the extreme right scene, because they now had someone who perhaps better represented their views also. And here as a table also shows that 2015 was kind of peak year when hate crimes peaked in Finland, and later this has been abated. So what happened after the Nordic Resistance Movement was banned in Finland in 2020? It was a long process, and since then they have tried to circumvent the ban in several ways, although we have had no actual violent counter reactions. Former members have been to some extent active within their former international networks. They have also founded several new organizations, some of which are investigated or waiting for the prosecutor's decision for illegally continuing banned organizations. Notable is, however, that these new groups have been less visible and in general are also less active, and they also have less members than the previous organization. As the website was closed, also they lost their funds, and this also shows in their activism. And to some extent also that groups are less visible applies to the extreme right scene in Finland in general. It also appears that neo-Nazi groups or activists try to use more decentralized organizational structure these days. Some have also suggested forms of accelerationism or leaderless resistance as a viable option to continue the activism. Most of the activities happen now in their own messaging groups in Telegram and other channels, partly, of course, due to the pandemic, so they cannot have street activism these days. Despite the ban of the Nordic Resistance Movement, Finnish security policies, in the light of the international development, far right as a growing threat. This is, of course, among other things, because of the links to international terrorist media, which mostly happens in online environment.